The following featured presentation is part of the Skywalking Network.
Welcome to Star Warsologies, the podcast about science and other academic fields of study seen in Star Wars. I'm one of your co-hosts, Melissa Miller. I'm a freelance science writer and also write for Star Wars Insider magazine.
And I'm James Floyd, your other co-host. I also freelance for Star Wars Insider magazine, and I am the author of Star Wars crossword puzzles and other word games from a galaxy far, far away. Today, we are going to chat about mass media and Star Wars. Our guest expert today is Samuel C. Spitale, former senior manager of global product development at Lucasfilm and author of How to Win the War on Truth, an illustrated guide to how mistruths are sold, why they stick, and how to reclaim reality. Welcome, Samuel.
Hey, it's great to be here. Thank you for having me.
Yes, very excited to talk about this very relevant topic and get into some of the things I never noticed about how mass media is or is not sort of present in Star Wars. So first off, why don't you tell us a little bit about your Star Wars story? Usually we ask people if it was a professional or just sort of personal interest. With you, it sounds like it was a bit of both.
Yeah, absolutely. Star Wars was, like many people, my first love growing up. And then I interned at Lucasfilm in public relations when I was in graduate school. Then after college, I moved to California for a full-time position in licensing at Lucasfilm. And that's where I grew from assistant to coordinator to manager to senior manager, ultimately. And so in that role, I managed the day-to-day development of Star Wars collectibles, which is basically anything that looks like a toy but is not. So this included, high-end statues and busts and figures like Sideshow and Gentle Giant, as well as prop replicas from EFX. I managed fine art and then also gift and novelty items like Hallmark ornaments or trading cards, Funko Pops and plush. So yeah, it spanned a lot. There were a lot of categories and a lot of products. And then like you, I also wrote for Star Wars Insider for a time. One of the columns I did was Interrogation Droid. This was like 10 or 15 years ago at this point, but it was basically silly questions with Star Wars actors. And then I would also profile different licensees and showcase their upcoming product or, cool new lines coming out. And so, yeah, I was at Lucasfilm for over a decade. And then about 10 years ago, after Disney purchased the company, I left Lucasfilm, moved to Los Angeles to focus on basically my own projects, which includes everything from, writing books to screenplays, storytelling. And so, yeah, kind of wherever it goes. I'm also teaching a class at Loyola Marymount this semester. And then I also wrote a coffee table book on Sideshow's collectible Star Wars line. So I think it was called Collecting a Galaxy. It was out about 4 or 5 years ago. And that's a really gorgeous book if you've ever seen it. I can't take credit for the layout or the design, but it's a beautiful coffee table book. I just wrote the copy for it, but it's visually a really nice book from Inside Editions. So yeah, that's basically my Star Wars story. And then my degrees originally, they were in mass communication. My bachelor's was in advertising and a minor in psychology. And then my master's was in media management. So around like 2015, 2016, I started gravitating back to those roots in my writing. I moved to LA to focus on like storytelling and screenwriting. But then as, the world started to change around us, I found myself writing more and more about like real world issues, inequality, socioeconomics, media literacy, misinformation. And then 2016, the election cycle happened. So yeah, I felt like that changed my trajectory a little bit. There was so much misinformation circulating during that time, which to me was blatantly obvious. But the more I talked to friends and family back home in Louisiana, where I grew up, the more I realized just how so many people believed stuff that was verifiably untrue.
Right.
And continue to do so. But it kind of baffled me because, if you're from the same place, you have the same amount of education, professional, you're kind of on similar tracks. You just assume those people kind of think like you do, or you have the same frame of reference. And 2016 was really kind of, eye-opening in that respect. Like, just how many family and friends were out of touch with reality or couldn't see through obvious BS. And so I kind of became fascinated, obsessed with, understanding how and why that occurs. It was helpful. My background was in communication and journalism, but it involves so much more than that. But that's definitely one of the key problems is our lack of media literacy. as especially, if you're not raised with the internet, so like our parents' age. My mom was visiting last week and, she's like scrolling, playing on Facebook, and she's constantly seeing these like ads for things, but she's not necessarily reading them as ads. They're showing up in her feed, no different than people's posts and news. And so it all kind of blurs. It's all like information that's personalized in her feed. And, there's no real distinction between like, no, that's advertising, that's marketing, that's journalism, that's news, and this is BS. And so, media literacy is, just such a huge problem because we encounter these days like 4,000 to 10,000 media messages a day.
Wow.
Gosh.
Right. And we very often fail to distinguish between them. And it used to be a lot easier. So, before the internet, if you were to watch TV at night, it was very obvious what was the news. And then you'd watch a TV show and you'd know that's entertainment. And then they'd cut to a commercial and you would know, oh, that's advertising. They're very separated and it was easier to consume. And that's not saying that, everything was always accurate and the lines weren't ever blurred. But today, since we get the majority of our information on mobile devices, social media and the internet, most people can't distinguish public relations from advertising, from publicity, from journalism, but only journalism is really concerned with getting to the truth. All the others are usually trying to obscure it. And like the oil and gas industry doesn't just sell us gasoline, but they sell us doubt in the science of global warming. Coca-Cola doesn't just sell soda, but they fund a bunch of dubious research that downplays the health risks of sugar intake and consuming sugar. And so on social media, as these information bulletins or messages come across our feed, we don't know one from the other. So part of the goal of the book was to help people become better media consumers and look at all of these things with a wider lens.
That's a really interesting way to put it in context, like thinking about, watching TV pre-internet versus after and everything being sort of muddled. I hadn't really thought about it in those sort of what has changed in my lifetime sort of aspects of it.
Yeah. And so, when you look at Twitter or Facebook, it's next to impossible. You have the word sponsored a lot of the times, but those are often the obvious ones. It's very obvious when they're trying to get you to buy a new vacuum cleaner or something. But, it's the sharing of information by people when that information has been essentially manufactured by very suspect individuals. That's not just, an advanced vacuum cleaner or an iRobot or whatever. It's also our political beliefs these days. If somebody is selling us something we don't need, then it's probably propaganda. And so much of it is propaganda these days.
So that sort of brings up the question of definitions, right? What is propaganda? I know that this is literally the whole topic of the conversation, but it's like, are there sort of easy definitions for, what you consider sort of media literacy, mass media, propaganda, some of the terms that we're using? Yeah,
there are definitely different definitions. One way to look at it as propaganda, information that's misleading, that's used to promote a particular point of view. And during the World Wars, propaganda got kind of a bad name. So they basically had to change the name propaganda to public relations. And so, which is essentially what it is. It's the same thing. And so we don't think of public relations that way. We think of public relations as like damage control or PSA, a public service announcement or something. But, it's not journalism. So public relations, advertising, marketing, all of those are propaganda because it's a biased message meant to influence, as opposed to like a PSA or a news item. Like an example I like to use is, don't drink and drive. That's just good advice. It's not even necessarily information. It's just good advice that no one's personally, privately benefiting. Society's better off, right? But if you say, don't drink and drive, take an Uber, well, then that's propaganda because someone's selling us something we don't need. Not to say that we don't need Uber, but someone benefits privately from that as opposed to the well-being of the public. So I consider almost everything these days seems like propaganda. All of the lies we're getting because it's never been easier, to disseminate them. So many of the checks and balances, regulation that was in place just has been slowly eroded and done away with. And so it's almost, it's like a free-for-all.
Right.
And so information, yeah, it's just so hard and overwhelming. I try to spend less and less time on social media these days because it is just like drowning in nonsense or half-truths, complete lies. So many people share stuff out of ignorance. But the ones that I guess really concern me or drive me the craziest are people that are deliberately misleading because they know they can sell it and they know people will believe it. And so that's what we see a lot of times with not just politicians, but think tanks and these power structures that, know good and well what they're doing, but that's the goal, is, to manipulate people. So
yeah. At some point, kind of news itself becomes propaganda because of what they kind of cherry pick to be reported as news. That it's like, we don't want to tell you about this. We do want to tell you about this, and that shapes your perceptions.
I mean, it can be, I like to look at or think of the nightly news, like your local nightly news. For the most part, it's pretty straightforward. There was a wreck, there was a fire, maybe a charity event, whatever it is.
Right.
But
at least one feel-good story. Yeah.
Feel-good story at the end. But for the most part, they're telling you the important things that are happening in your area that you should be aware of. With that, of course, dog bites man is not a story, but man bites dog is a story. You're only getting the negative stuff or what may be outliers, but the fact that there are outliers is why it's newsworthy. Even if crime is fairly low, if there is a homicide in your neighborhood, then of course it's news because that's something you need to be aware of. So it could, kind of give you a false impression that crime's greater than it is, which again, the media could sometimes be guilty of. But at the same time, local news is usually a good bar for what news should sound like and be like, as long as it's, independently operated and it's not part of some large network of partisan. A lot of them are owned these days by these big partisan conglomerates kind of a thing. But
yeah, I was going to say, are there any leftover like that? I didn't even know that, but I haven't watched local news in 20 years.
I live in LA, so I have been watching local news, especially, with fires and those types of things. Fires, weather,
car chases.
I've been watching more local news. Yeah, of course. LA loves to show a car chase. Now that I would say is probably the biggest non-news item that the local news here likes to. And I always wonder, why are we watching the car chase? Anybody that this would be relevant to would be on the road, not watching TV at home.
Well, I think it's because they have pictures, they have video, because it looks cooler than just like a guy reading off of a paper. There's a car chase. It's going down the 205.
I just don't feel like I ever need to see that if I'm in the comfort of my home.
Yeah, I only said it because you said you were in LA and it's such a trope, but I swear to God, every time I'm in a hotel in like the LA area and turn on the TV, they're showing a car chase. So I had to at least get that out there. That's literally us watching a car wreck. So.
It is completely, or soon to be a car wreck.
Right.
Yeah, and that's, I feel like, the main time that I'm like, why are we seeing this on local news? But yeah, it is an LA thing. So maybe it's just part of the culture here. I don't know.
So we've gotten into sort of how this works in our world and why you sort of transitioned into this, in terms of timing. But I'm curious to dive into the Star Wars of it all and like how you see the relevance there. Something that I hadn't really noticed, I guess, before setting up for this discussion was how news and mass media isn't really part of Star Wars from the beginning.
Absolutely. And I honestly think that was a pretty smart call on George's part. In creating the original movies, I think the lack of central media or mass media ties into the Western theme and the sense of isolation, Luke growing up on the farm. And, it plays into a lot of kind of mythology, that sense of isolation and Wild West and unruliness, I don't think would hit the same way if everybody in the galaxy could watch the same TV show every night. And I think it would also raise more. It would just be a big old can of worms. It raised too many questions. Like, did the Empire own all media outlets? Did the Rebels have their own media outlet? If there was news media, then does that mean there's entertainment media? We see Anakin and Palpatine in the prequels at like a live entertainment venue, but we never saw anyone watching recorded entertainment in George's
holiday special, baby.
Well, okay, that's true. Although I don't think that's canon.
Wow.
But yes, you're right. You are totally right. So I guess they do have variety shows in Star Wars.
And cooking shows.
And cooking shows, yeah.
You know, that's true. I don't think about the holiday special, but
Nor should you.
Right.
I'm not recommending
wow.
anybody watch this.
No, it is hard to watch, and it's long. It's like 3 hours of
Yes, nonsense.
yeah, it's torture. But, you know, is there like, is the media capitalistic? Is it state run? There are award shows. You know, is the media informational? Is it infotainment? Is it indoctrination? And, you know, what is the empire? How would they, you know, are they using the media? Are they using it to demonize marginalized groups like Fox News does? You know,
Right.
does it back anyone who threatens their power? Also, what's the mass media's relationship to capitalism? Are they independent news outlets? Are they all owned by the empire? Media is determined by the economic and political systems. So, anyway, I think it was very smart of him to remove media altogether for the original trilogy, because it does give the galaxy more of a, I don't know, it makes it seem bigger and more believable that, you know, you could be a nobody somewhere, be hidden or disappear, or, you know,
Right.
Media makes the world a lot smaller.
Oh, it definitely adds that sense of a long time ago, because it's in a, you know, landscape before mass media. You know, like you said, it's
Yes.
that mythology. It's people who live in the Wild West and people who live in the forests where you go out into the dark and there's dragons, as opposed to everything is like
Right.
known. And it's like, oh, would Luke really care? Be like, oh yeah, I'm watching the same shows. Oh yeah, when Biggs left, we can communicate with each other easily.
Right?
You know, I'm tracking everybody on social media. You know, he mentions that he hates the Empire, and how does he get that? Is he seeing it firsthand, or is he seeing some sort of propaganda, or, you know, just reaching that decision on his own of the news of stormtroopers, you know, save humans, but Jawas, you know, are never being rescued by stormtroopers in the local news.
You know, if you have the internet, if you have these things, then again, the galaxy becomes very small. So there's less alienation and sense of discovery and all of that.
I mean, and to
Yeah.
me, now that we're talking about it, there's so many ways it would have come into it if it existed.
It would have influenced a lot.
Right. Yeah.
You know, you wouldn't need a protocol droid. You would just have an app. Like, a lot of droids would be useless if you have the internet or something similar to that.
Right.
Star Wars is primitive in a lot of ways, and that's kind of the charm, is that you have this high tech, but it's also very primitive.
I think that goes back to George Lucas's kind of idea for Star Wars, was that anything in Star Wars would have to be understood by somebody living in the 1940s. So the idea of smartphones and apps might not have been able to really be easily understood, whereas a droid, because it's like they'd already had robots in fiction. But at the same time, we also see camera droids in the Senate in episode 1. And so obviously they're recording it. I assumed it was to be broadcast on the galactic equivalent of C-SPAN or something.
Right. Exactly.
That's true.
I've never heard that, James, about the 1940s thing.
Oh, I remember hearing it somewhere, that maybe a Pablo Hidalgo thing that George kind of explained it, is like, it didn't have to exist in the 1940s, but at least somebody in that time frame could readily understand it.
Okay. No, fair enough. I just hadn't ever heard that particular decade mentioned. But yeah, I mean, it's like news, if nothing else. How do people even find out Alderaan gets blown up? How do they even find out that the Empire, you know, took over? Just with it being such a massive place, right? We're talking about a galaxy, not just a country, not just one planet. There's no way without some sort of news system. I get that they're disconnected, but they're actually quite connected, right? Like, if nothing else, this goes to our other question about why is all the air breathable? Like, you wouldn't know if you hadn't had communications and learned about these other places that you even could go to. I honestly had never really noticed the lack of it until we sort of started talking about this subject. But I think you're right that it's a savvy move in the end, because it's such a slippery slope.
Right, because then once you start down, it's like, oh, this impacts this, which impacts this, and yeah.
If they had mass media of any sort, how do you erase that the Jedis, like, how does it within one generation become the Jedis might have been a myth, you know, as opposed to like reality that all your ancestors lived in for thousands of years?
Absolutely, yeah.
the Star Wars universe has kind of come full 180 on that. By the time we get to Andor, we see talk shows, we hear the word spin doctor. Cassian is pretending to be a journalist as is covered at Gorman, but there are actual news journalists there covering things live as if, they would be covering things going on in our world with a war going on behind them or demonstrations. And so, we see that, we see Mon Mothma's speech being broadcast and the race to cut off the transmission. So it's there now, but it still has those questions of, with the Empire in control, who controls the media? Do they have the final say, or are there independent organizations?
And it would make sense if, like you see in Andor, there is media, but then once the Empire has total control, right, they shut it all down except for their own propaganda or their own just information gathering or sharing. So it's an easy way to explain it, why there wasn't media in the old movies. But
Right. No, but it's an interesting, I hadn't really thought about how different that is. And yes, you can wave it away, but yeah, that's an awful lot to have changed. So, for me, it's more just about the sensibilities of like, okay, if you're going to make this show Andor, they clearly had the plan, I think, from the beginning to really show that sort of descent into fascism, and you have to include what the media does and doesn't cover and how they cover it as part of that story. And it kind of makes me wonder if they got any pushback from, whoever is keeping the canon these days in terms of like, well, that wasn't in the original trilogy. So like, it is a change for the Star Wars universe to say, yes, all these things existed.
Yeah, and I guess there hadn't been a real reason to even explore that, but it makes sense for the themes that Andor is about to show that aspect of it.
It's not a metaphor. It's a literal.
But, if there are journalists, then, does the Empire end up outlawing journalism, or do they all just have to work for the Empire then? Or, it's just a lot of media changes everything because it's mass communication. And if you can your message out through the masses, then, you can pretty much tell them or create whatever alternate history you want.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I do feel like it would be on brand for the Empire to pretty quickly defund PBS, PGBS, right?
PBS
Public Galactic Broadcasting System or something would very quickly be like, oh, we don't have money for that.
I'm sure they do have money for it. And, the new version of Sesame System has, all sorts of pro-Empire propaganda that,
Oh my God.
Bert and Ernie are Imperial troopers and,
oh my God.
I've just ruined it for you, haven't I?
No, I mean, I can see it, right? I can see that that's what would happen. It's like product placement, but but political. Mm-hmm. But I don't know what the equivalent of woke is in the Star Wars universe or whatever, but it's you got to make it very clear that these people living alternative lifestyles aren't actually, and all that kind of stuff. Yeah, it's a little real. Yeah.
Too real.
Yeah. The only other obvious propaganda I can think of is in Solo. He's in the train station and there's an ad to join the Imperial Army and they're playing the march, the Imperial March in this ad for join the army. I mean, that is not, again, subtle propaganda and has, very obvious analog to our real life or whatever. But that's the only other one I could come up with.
Well, I remember a line the first time I feel like I recognized media or remembered media in the Star Wars universe was, besides the holiday special, I guess, which I completely forgot. But one of the novels from the 90s, it was, I think, Dave Wolverton's The Courtship of Princess Leia. I don't know if you guys read that. I read it back in the day, so, it's been 30 years. But I remember there being a line in there that made me chuckle at the time. But basically, Leia and the dude that's courting her, there's an assassination attempt. And I remember Leia or somebody commenting after the fact that no one came to their help, but somehow it was recorded by 3 different media outlets or 3 different angles at the same time. And I remember laughing, thinking oh, that was pretty funny. But then I was oh, wait, then this means that are media everywhere in Star Wars? That just seems, I don't know. It felt less Star Wars.
It kind of becomes paparazzi, they're oh, we're tracking the royal. We don't actually interact with them. We're just the invisible fly on the wall. But it creates that. And then, we see at the wedding at the end that the news media is there to cover it, from what I remember.
Yeah, remember the joke line, oh, that's funny. But then it was well, then wouldn't their entire calendar be nothing but media appearances trying to sell them on, the New Republic or like when you mention it, then you have to think of, then how would that actually impact what they're trying to do politically?
Mm-hmm.
And it would have to be nonstop media, like coverage and trying to argue your point, a lot less action oriented, because the battle of ideas would have to be fought over the media, if you have the media.
Well, and I love ruining things with the holiday, reminding people that the holiday special exists. So it makes me sort of happy. Because, I thought of it pretty early on in the discussion. I was like, well, that shows, entertainment, the cooking show. I'm trying to remember what else.
I think we're spending way too much time on the holiday special here, but...
Yeah.
Well, but George Lucas, even if he pretends it doesn't exist now, was in fact involved in that. And it was before Empire Strikes Back, right? And Return of the Jedi. So it's like, it wasn't supposed to be a gotcha moment, but it's like, for things that George Lucas was involved in, there was at least entertainment media.
True.
And when you think about it, it's really weird that they watch a cartoon about Boba Fett and Luke and Han. So like Luke and Han and Chewie are known heroes that people are making their own cartoons about and posting them being broadcast. And I'm sure Boba Fett is like, why am I being featured in this cartoon show? It's really weird. Like, I am a real person. My licensing person did not sign off on this.
That just goes with your clone agreement, right? If you have if you sign that, he didn't read that whole form,
He was a kid at the time.
Oh, well, there you go. That's a question for our law, episode.
The Star Wars equivalent of Disney owns his likeness in perpetuity.
Right, exactly. So.
Absolutely.
Well, we've gotten very silly here, but if there are other serious topics we haven't covered yet, I am open to that, and I'll stop bringing up the holiday special.
Well, I'm curious, from your point of view, do you see any of the aspects of mass media that we have here that we haven't seen yet in Star Wars?
We've seen advertising with the prequels, with Coruscant have ads. We've seen, I'm trying to think, is there anything we haven't seen?
I'm trying to remember all the stuff Bix is watching. Are there reality shows?
There's Keeping Up with the Calrissians.
Now, I'd watch that.
It was a real question, James. I don't remember what Bix was watching. What was Bix watching in Andor?
I remember Edie watching. Oh, no, they were watching the same show. It was that like celebrity talk show, Entertainment Tonight type thing.
Okay. So definitely like entertainment-y news kind of thing. Okay, I couldn't remember.
The Keeping Up with the Calrissians is from a Robot Chicken sketch of flipping through channels.
Got it. George Lucas also involved potentially then.
True. Or at least approved. Yeah. Yeah, I love the Robot Chicken stuff.
But so advertising, there are billboards, right, in Coruscant, at least some sort of like entertainment television type thing. The books I was thinking of, I don't know if you've watched Skeleton Crew. There's at least spend your whole next weekend watching Skeleton Crew. It's very good. But there's like books, right? Like fictional books, if I remember correctly, or were they like history books, James?
They were more like storybooks. I think there was history and stuff in the class, but one of the characters is reading basically kind of an ebook that has illustrations and such. And
right. So that would be another way that Jedi lore and heroes stories and stuff like that would get passed on. That seems like it could be empire proof, but maybe that's naive, right? Can fascism, if we're talking about it, or are they burning books or whatever the equivalent for e-readers are?
Destroying holocrons.
Right. Bricking everybody's Kindles or whatever the equivalent is so that people can't, even if these seem like harmless things, like adventure stories for children, they're glorifying the Force users or they're glorifying independence for planets and things like that. Is that something that you can see the Empire, is that an early part of this descent into fascism, or is that now that we've got our grip on planets, we can, drill down into this stuff?
Right. There's so many things to consider. I guess it's easy just to say, right, the Empire tried to erase or outlaw as much storytelling, media, information sharing as possible to, keep people from thinking freely. And what was shared was probably more about law and order and obedience and maintaining the order.
There's probably the equivalent of Moms for Liberty type groups that are we want to censor things that are the things we don't like. So it's this book, glorifies aliens of all kinds, and it's like, nope, we're going to tamp down that. Or we're talking about, different historical things that involve, the Jedi or independence groups. And it's like, no, we're going to write the marginalized people out. We're going to write the enemies of the state out of the picture. Imagine that's one of the first things, because I think in our own history with the rise of fascism, the first casualties are the truth and, education and recording history and turning the media into such a thing that, not that the media is lying, is that you don't know when the media is lying. And so you just start to doubt everything, and you start doubting the truth because you don't know that it's the truth.
Yeah. I mean, I would imagine, the empire taking over would be a lot like Nazi Germany, probably. Mm-hmm. Like, you have Hitler controlling the airwaves. So whatever, just disseminating, whatever manipulative talking points they need to get out at the time to demonize or justify or, disregard or whatever. And then, probably destruction of books and storytelling and anything that counters their narrative. But I feel like Nazi Germany is probably a good analogy. And that's kind of what George based the empire off of anyway, in a lot of ways. So
if you're talking about, the book, or with people back in Louisiana, when you go back for Thanksgiving or whatever, do you ever use Star Wars as a way to talk about propaganda and descents into fascism and, misinformation and stuff like that?
Well, actually, I do use it in the book. I actually have a page in the book that I have a media literacy chapter where I kind of talk about the difference between advertising, marketing, PR, branding. And I do use Star Wars as an example, kind of like in summary, right. As a Star Wars marketing campaign, versus advertising versus publicity versus PR, using Star Wars as one example and what all the different types of mass communication look like using Star Wars.
And we'll post that on the show notes page.
Yeah, absolutely. I sent you guys a screen grab of that. I think that's the main way I use that in the book. In conversations, I don't guess I actually have, but I should. It's almost like it's so close to home that I don't think Star Wars, I'm so close to it that I almost don't think of it as an example in conversations or social interactions. Right.
Okay. No, because I definitely pre most recent election thought about it and said it at least a few times. Is like any Star Wars fan, I would like to think any Star Wars fan could recognize that, I don't know, a vote for Trump is a vote for Krennic. I don't know exactly the right matchup there or whatever, but it was like, to me, so very obvious. But I know that there are obviously lots of people who love Star Wars who don't see this or don't see it as bad, or I don't know what. So I'm trying to find, I guess, ways to use it, which is why I asked.
Yeah. Well, and I think, right, the fact that they can't see it just shows how misled people are on a variety of issues. If you can't tell that, the current administration is oppressive, stripping away rights, overturning, decades of civil rights and precedent, locking people in cages. Like it seems so obvious that, it's like so many of these things. The fact that people can't see it drives me crazy. But as I write out in the book, we talked about the media literacy part, which is, obviously a huge part of it. But that's just, one chapter in the book. So, there's so much else at work keeping us in the dark. Psychology plays such a huge role, not just becoming aware of our biases, but, just understanding how the mind works, self-preservation, not wanting to admit we're wrong, confirmation bias, only looking at information or memes or whatever that cement our own point of view or our own beliefs, because acknowledging we're wrong or we made a mistake or we're misled takes a lot of willpower and courage. And the average person doesn't want to have to do that much thinking, no less introspection and in admitting, that they've been duped. Right. So, there's so much in our psychology that keeps us from seeing the truth. It's easier to just keep being misled until something drastic happens. It makes us rethink everything. And oftentimes, it has to happen to us personally. And unfortunately, enough people are going to have to be affected personally, or someone in their lives are going to have to be affected before they finally wake up, which is sad. But, that's just kind of how human nature is. But so psychology is a huge part. And I remember reading one time that why there's so much willful blindness is less about intelligence and more about courage. Having the courage to, again, admit we're wrong, admit we've been misled, but also what that does is open up a line of thinking that makes us have to question everything we've been taught. And you see people that have had a truly traumatic event or something happen where they do start rethinking everything. But the average person has too many mechanisms in place to keep that from happening. But if you admit you're misled, politically and voted for, a fascist dictator, then what else was I wrong about? Maybe I need to rethink religion and, all these other things. And it's easier just to keep subscribing to the misbelief than it is to really look at things critically. And so that's a huge part. And emotional intelligence too, which we didn't really talk about, but, and that's where actually the fascist propaganda comes in. Fascist propaganda appeals to negative emotions because negative emotions can override critical thinking and reasoning. Any media message that makes us hate somebody, fear somebody, or be angry at somebody is often propagandistic, because if you can activate those negative emotions, then you turn off critical thinking.
And so that presents a real challenge to deprogram people to, let go of their hatred and be willing to think critically and be willing to have that courage to admit that they were wrong. How could you do that on a society-wide scale?
Yeah, right. Understanding the problem is difficult and complex enough. The solutions are even more, difficult and complex, because again, it's not just one thing, it's multiple things. It's becoming media literate. It's understanding our psychology, also, becoming aware of our biases, how we tend to believe things from our in-group and find it easy to discount things from an out-group. The emotional intelligence, recognizing when we read a media post that was defamatory towards immigrants or disparaging. And if we're picturing an immigrant with a different skin tone, it makes us easy to subscribe to that. Also, but recognizing this headline or this fake news article is designed just to make us hate immigrants. So recognizing the negative emotions and saying, oh, wait, this is clearly not a real news headline, because a real news headline would not have the emotional activation. An example I like to do is if you see a headline like immigrants are taking our jobs, clearly that's a propaganda headline, because the proper headline should be corporations hire immigrants over American workers because they could pay them under the table and pay them a sub-minimum wage. That's the non-propaganda headline. So it's anything making us hate a disadvantaged or minority group is usually some kind of fascist propaganda, because the facts are usually more complicated than that. But demonizing somebody makes an easy scapegoat. And then that's how people with bad intentions get power. That is part of the fascist playbook, demonizing minority groups. And you need propaganda to do that. So demonizing these groups and scapegoating is we should really look at that as target marketing and market segmentation applied to politics. So, you can't sell everything to everybody, right? You can't sell Barbie dolls to boys. You don't sell convertibles to kids. So you have to choose a target audience. To sell to them, you kind of have to alienate the other people, right? You can't sell to everybody. And so demonization and basically outgrouping anything that establishes an outgroup and us and them, it's kind of like applying target marketing with the worst intent. Anything that creates an us versus them, as opposed to unifying people. And there's a lot of that going on these days. Those are the culture war issues. So recognizing when that's happening. The one thing we haven't talked about solutions is, media accountability. We used to have a fairness doctrine, which mandated that media outlets had to put on both sides to any topical, controversial issue, kind of. And then the Reagan administration killed that. And so immediately after, right-wing radio popped up, Rush Limbaugh, and then Fox News popped up, and outlets that basically didn't want to be held to the standards of journalism.
Right.
They essentially sprung up as propaganda outlets. And I don't think we would be in the mess we're in this country without those propaganda outlets, because they have, for 2 generations now, created an alternate reality that is just not based in reality. And then, tech companies as well, We all remember when, Mark Zuckerberg and some of these guys were in front of Congress and all the Congress people were performing theatrics, like chewing them out. Your platform or you, like whatever. But Congress is the ones who passed the Communications Decency Act or whatever in 96, I think. But there was like Section 230 absolved tech companies from being held accountable for anything posted on their sites. So if Congress wanted to do anything about hate speech or anything, they could just repeal Section 230. But they don't want to because all the misinformation and the lies benefits them. But if social media companies faced the same regulation as, say, publishers for print media, it would be a different story. Publishers are held accountable, liable, or things that aren't true. And so if they would just make tech companies be held to the same standards, then that would, help a lot. Because the tech companies have definitely only worsened the problem. So there are things that could be done. And, like the lawsuit against Fox News for lying. The more of these types of suits happen, the more these media outlets are held accountable. I think that could go a long way too. Because at some point, they can't keep paying all this money. However, I do think that whenever those types of suits do happen, part of the suit should be about having to admit on air what they lied about.
Right.
As many times as they lied about it. So if they told 8,000 lies about, voting machines, then they need to correct that a good 8,000 times, like to their viewers.
At the top of every hour.
Yeah.
Right? Completely. So media accountability would go a long way, but we'd have to have the political will.
Right. Well, switching to our final questions, tell us about your favorite Star Wars character.
Oh, it's so hard to pick. Of course, I love Boba Fett because everybody loves Boba Fett because he's just so cool. But I guess, growing up with the original trilogy, it's hard not to, see myself as Luke. The original trilogy, his story, his journey. And so Luke resonates with me probably the most. But Boba Fett from just the coolness factor.
Cool. Well, if somebody wanted to be cool like you and go into a field of mass communications and media literacy, how would you recommend going about that?
I would say that, if they're in school, then, going into the field of media studies, mass communication, especially journalism. I feel like we're in desperate need of legitimate journalists these days. Degrees in any of those fields, if that's what they're interested in. More than anything, just being loyal to the truth above all else and trying to champion the truth in their lives or it's just in all aspects of life.
Yeah, I like that. That's great.
Well, where can we find you online? Do you have anything coming out soon?
Mostly just some talks coming up, which I'll put on my website. But my personal site is www.samuelcspitale.com. And I actually have a YouTube channel that's at How to Win the War on Truth, where I'll hit different topics and kind of debunk things and talk about the truth behind something. And on social media, one of those two handles, Samuel C. Spitale or How to Win the War on Truth. I'm pretty much.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much for being here and talking this all out with us. It definitely gives me a lot to think about and still trying to find those ways. Star Wars and Star Wars fandom can hopefully change the world a little bit here for the better.
Yep. Thank you
Absolutely.
so much.
Thank you, guys.
We're going to be at Los Angeles Comic-Con. Come check us out. We have a couple panels. First up, we have a Star Wars Critters panel. It is Saturday, September 27th from 12 to 1 p.m.
Yeah, it's going to be awesome. We're going to have S.T. Bendy there to talk about her awesome bestiary book and ask questions of all of us scientists and Star Wars lovers about critters. And I can never get enough critters.
Especially porgs.
Especially porgs. It's on the list. I'm also helping with two other panels. Those are both on Sunday, September 28th. I'll be moderating a BattleBots anniversary panel for the 25th anniversary of that awesome show. So come check us out at 3 o'clock. And then at 4 o'clock, I am helping out with the Nerd Night panel where we're doing fun Nerd Night science talks, but many of the scientists will be in cosplay. So that'll be super fun. We're also co-hosting the STEM Mixer on Saturday evening. That's going to be at Audiograph Beer Company, just a couple blocks away from the convention center. So come out from 6 to 9 p.m. on Saturday, September 27th, and join us for that. Look forward to seeing you at LA Comic-Con. Samuel, you'll also be at LA Comic-Con. Tell us more about what you're doing there.
Yes, I will be. I'm doing a panel on Sunday, I believe at 1 p.m., called A Crash Course in Media Literacy, or it may be changed to How to Win the War on Truth, the panel. One of those two. I don't remember what we went with. But basically, yeah, it's kind of an introduction to my book and an introduction to media literacy. Yeah, so I look forward to meeting some folks there, and come swing by if you're at LA Comic Con.
If you're at LA Comic Con, go check it out.
Yes, we'll see you there.
We got something special to announce. Our friends at Galaxy Tours, which do Star Wars and Indiana Jones tour site visits in Tunisia, have a special Science of the Galaxy Far, Far Away group tour coming up.
Yes, November 11th through 14th of 2025, the Galaxy Tours is putting on a cool special tour that's going to have special guest Lee Bullock, who's a physicist and lifelong Star Wars collector, along for the ride, giving scientific insights along the way during visits to all of the really cool filming sites in Tunisia.
Yep, they'll be visiting such places as the Skywalker and Lars homestead, where the Mos Espa slave quarters are, as well as the Mos Espa town site. Plus a few things from Indiana Jones, but this is your chance to go and also hear from a scientist.
We're hoping these will be a success, and there'll be more science-based Galaxy tours coming up in the future, and hopefully us and some of our awesome Star Warsologies scientists can get more involved. If you do decide to sign up for this 4-day tour in Tunisia, make sure you leave a note in the order notes on the final page of the checkout saying that you heard about it from Star Warsologies, and that way they'll know that we sent you.
Make your reservation at galaxytours.com.
Yeah, check it out. Hopefully James and I get to go at some point. I really, really want to go to Tunisia. You stay overnight at like Luke's homestead, drink blue milk. I like it says binary sunset ambiance, since obviously there's actually only one sun on Earth, but it just sounds like a really magical time. So if you check that out, make sure you send us lots of pictures.
That wraps up this episode of Star Warsologies. We want to thank our guest, Samuel C. Spitale, and we want to thank all of you for listening. Please also rate, review, and subscribe to the podcast on your favorite service, and share with your friends.
If you're looking for the links and other things we talked about, including Samuel's illustration of different media concepts as told in Star Wars, check out our show notes page available at skywalkingthroughneverland.com/star-warsologies. And also check out our YouTube channel where we post some episodes with related visuals from Star Wars.
If you have an idea for a topic for Star Warsologies or know an expert we should interview, let us know at Star Warsologies on Instagram and Blue Sky, or at starwarsologies@gmail.com. No topic is off limits, even if Maz Kanata's Mexican restaurant has a special on Taco Donna's for Taco Tuesday.
We also have a fan group on Facebook. It's named Star Warsologies Podcast Fan Group, so join that today and chat with us and your fellow listeners.
Check out my Star Wars book, Star Wars Crossword Puzzles and Other Word Games from a Galaxy Far, Far Away. It's out from Chronicle Books. It is available at your local bookstore or on bookshop.org, Barnes & Noble, Amazon, and other online booksellers.
We're part of the Skywalking Network, where you can find a variety of other great shows about Star Wars, Disney, and Marvel, including classic Marvel Star Wars comics and the flagship show Skywalking Through Neverland. There's also a YouTube show called Today in Star Wars History. You can find all of that at skywalkingnetwork.com.
See you next time on Star Warsologies, where we will bring to you our Legacy Expo panel.